June 6th, 1996, in Rowlett, Texas, a brutal crime took place that took the lives of two innocent young boys and left their mother, Darlie, with many wounds, including a severe slash wound to her neck. After dialing 911 and having police, paramedics, and even a canine unit brought in, the series of events that unfolded would ultimately lead to Darlie's arrest, conviction, and death penalty charge for the murder of her young children. While this all sounds like a cut and dried story, this isn't even the beginning of what actually happened, and the story is still not over. Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth, and this is the final episode of the Darlie Routier story. As many of you know, for over a year, I have immersed myself in the Darlie Routier case. I covered her case, her trial, her bond hearings, her appeal, and her writ of habeas corpus. It's hard to imagine a time when I wasn't thinking about or picking apart some portion of the testimony. I, however, am just one podcaster who gets the luxury of moving on to different true crime and paranormal cases. Those that were directly involved in the case, for them, it will be something that will never leave their minds or their hearts. Now, personally, after having gone through all of the trial readings and then some, it left me exhausted, frustrated, and even angry at times. So much so that I would speak aloud to the screen as if it were this living thing that could hear my frustration. You didn't get to hear those parts. I edited those out for the episodes, but often wonder if I should have left them in. Hindsight's 2020, right? But for as exhausted and frustrated and angry that I became, I again get to move on. The family doesn't. And I have no skin in the game. I am no one when it comes to this case. I was a person who simply became intrigued by all of the information that seemed to make sense until it didn't. Until I had to see and hear for myself what truly happened in that courtroom. And even later, as time went on and more information came out so many years ago, something just wasn't adding up for me. The case, even today, it has two very adamant camps. You're either for Darlie or you're against Darlie, and each side is 1000% sure that they are right in their opinion. After going through all of these documents, reading the entire set of trial transcripts, the appeal, the writ, and finally the writ affidavits, I too have formed my own opinion. And I want to point out that in my mind, and the way that I look at it, is that there are those who may have been involved, that is, involved in the planning or having knowledge of the crime, and those who actually committed the crime. And that's where it actually gets a little complicated, at least for me. Now, keep in mind, I drew this conclusion after having official information that was released years after Darlie was convicted, especially the affidavits that were released in her writ of habeas corpus. However, we all know that the jury did not have the luxury of having this information and that they had to go by what was presented to them at that time. So in regards to that, here's what I can say. Had I been a member of the jury and heard only the testimony that the jury heard, I would not have voted guilty. There was just way too much circumstantial evidence. Nothing that would lead me to believe that what I heard or saw deserved to put someone in jail for the rest of their life. I was shocked at the lack of notes or the actual documentation by the police. People who came in and got on the stand and said that Darlie, quote unquote, confessed to something or quote unquote, told them something without having any proof just doesn't cut it. As it's often said, pics or it didn't happen, which in today's world doesn't really cut it anymore with AI and all that, but that's a story for a different day. Yet they did find her guilty and then they sentenced her to death. However, what we learn after that fact is astonishing at best. No one knew it at the time because the information hadn't yet been public, but Darlie's defense team's hands were tied. Well, I take that back. At least two people knew this at the time of the trial: Darlie's attorney, Mr. Mulder, and her husband, Darren. What people didn't know at the time of the trial was that Darlie's attorney, Mulder, who had represented Darlie's mom and Darren in the gag order issue, had a conversation with Darren and Darlie Key, Darlie's mom. They wanted Mr. Mulder to represent Darlie. And at first I thought, well, maybe they believed that the court-appointed attorneys weren't good enough. And they had somehow come across Mulder to represent them for this gag order hearing, and so they asked him if he would instead represent Darlie. It didn't seem as though this was the whole case, though. It appears as though Mulder kind of found a way to invite himself into the case. We, or the jury, didn't know it at the time of the trial, but because Mulder had represented Darren in the gag order issue, it was likely a conflict of interest. Darren believed at the time that Mulder was his attorney. He even said so in his affidavit years later. Quote, "In September and October 1996, I believe, based on Mr. Mulder's comments to me, that he was my attorney. On October 21st, 1996, Mr. Mulder became lead counsel in my wife's criminal trial. Somehow, Darlie's current attorney before Mulder took over, her current attorneys, Douglas Parks and Wayne Huff, found out that Mulder might become Darlie's attorney. So they approached Mulder and they told him that this might be an issue because they were looking at Darren as the one who committed the crime. Mulder then told Darren about this, and according to Darren's same affidavit years later, he said, quote, "I continued to meet with Mr. Mulder in August 1996. During one of the meetings I had with Mr. Mulder in August 1996, he told me that the court-appointed attorneys in my wife's case, Wayne Huff and Douglas Parks, had confided in him that they were going to try and portray me as the person guilty of the murder of my sons Damon and Devin because they thought that I had something to do with the deaths of my sons. I told Mr. Mulder that if we hired him, I did not want him to, quote, go after, unquote, me. Mr. Mulder agreed that if hired to represent my wife, he would not argue as part of the defense that I was in any way responsible for the death of my children. It's unknown if Darlie's mom, Darlie Key, knew about this at the time. But as we'll discover, Darlie's stepfather and Darren had a conversation just prior to the crime about committing insurance fraud. And by implicating Darren, would also implicate Darlie's stepfather. So it all kind of worked out for the whole group, for everyone except Darlie. This official attorney change happened in October of 1996, but according to Darren's affidavit, he had this conversation with him about being the prime suspect with Mulder in August of 1996. Now, I don't know why Darlie's attorneys would approach Mulder and tell him that Darren was a suspect, only to have him turn around to tell Darren this information. And it's more likely, at least in my opinion, that Mulder wanted the case. It meant a lot of press and a lot of television time, and this is something that attorneys are always after, right? So Mulder caught wind of this, found out that they were going after Darren, and in order to get his foot in the door, possibly said to Darren, hey, I found out that Darlie's attorneys are pointing at you as a prime suspect, but if you hire me, I'll be sure that your name stays out of it. A stretch? Maybe. Plausible? Certainly. This is why Mr. Mulder's hands were tied. He had to come up with a believable theory for the jury. There were 2 adults in the home at the time this occurred, and now he couldn't bring Darren into the mix, so they had to come up with another idea, and that idea was of an unknown intruder. Now, first things first, here's a guy, Darren, who claims to love his wife. They've both lost 2 precious children. But when it came down to him or her, he made sure that they took all of the focus away from him, which left only Darlie and an unknown intruder who could have committed the crime. Second, there is in fact an unidentified fingerprint that has been located in the house. And I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that this has yet to have testing done on it. Now, I know that as of April of 2024, more testing has been approved, but as of yet, nothing has come back. I was going to mention this a little bit later on, and I still will, but if you want the most up-to-date information on Darlie's case, follow her sister, Danelle on TikTok. She is awesome at giving updates and information. She'll even answer your questions. And she gives us information that we may not know of yet or that isn't public. And I'll have her link in the show notes. Now, that being said, all of this DNA testing that has been requested and sat on for all of these years kind of has me thinking that, maybe the state of Texas just doesn't want to admit that they were wrong and that someone screwed up along the way. In this case, maybe several someones. But this does point to either A, an intruder, or B, a second person was knowingly involved. It seems that her current defense team of Douglas Parks and Wayne Huff, they were doing well for Darlie, and they had investigators in place already working on the blood samples and other evidence from the scene. They were doing their job. They were working for their client until Mulder came along and not only didn't continue on using the work that had already been done because Mulder had promised Darren not to blame him, but all of the work that Doug Parks' investigators had done up to that point was never used. Now, Mulder's team had a 2-hour meeting with them, and they, being Terry Labor and Bart Epstein, fully expected for Mulder to call them after this 2-hour meeting to present their findings, which would help his client. But Mulder never did, and he eventually just let them go. We've all heard the arguments after the fact about how Darlie had an ineffective assistance of counsel. And yes, I agree with this. It's my feeling that Mulder was so certain that no matter what was thrown his way, he could most definitely defend Darlie. It was a large case, and to be one of the attorneys of record involved in this case is a big deal for any attorney. One thing is for certain, is that when this silly string video was played for the jury, Mulder never offered the video of what happened before then, even though he had the video to show the jury. The prayer service, the sadness, the tears, none of that. That video was never shown to the jury. Her sister Dina was never allowed to testify that she is the one who had the idea of the silly string and the balloons. So much that should have been done in Darlie's trial wasn't. Now, we shouldn't forget, though, that Mulder, in his closing, actually references Darren as a possible suspect for the first and only time. And this is what he says, quote, "It's curious to me, and I have never for a minute doubted the innocence of Darren Routier, but, he of all people had the most to gain here. She had a couple of $100,000 worth of insurance on her. She doesn't gain anything monetarily. $5,000 apiece for those children, but they cleared him like that." But let's continue on because there's so much more. In this same affidavit, again, provided years later by Darren, we learn that he had approached his father-in-law, Darlie's stepfather, about an insurance scam. And here's what he had to say. Here's what Darren had to say. Quote, "In March or April 1996, I asked my father-in-law, Robbie Gene Key, if he knew anyone who would agree to burglarize my home as part of an insurance scam. I said that I would arrange for my family to be absent from my house at 5801 Eagle Drive, that someone who I would hire would come to the house and take away the furniture and other items from my house in a U-Haul truck, and that I would then pay that person from the proceeds of the resulting insurance payments." This was 1 to 2 months prior to the crime. Darren also said, quote, "In 1994, I spoke to a person about my Jaguar automobile. In that conversation, I said that it wouldn't bother me if the Jaguar was stolen. That person then stole the Jaguar." So in 1994, he had someone steal the Jaguar. 2 years later, he approached his father-in-law about having his house robbed, ironically, just before the crime occurred. So my first thought is, who thinks like this? Who decides that for money, they're going to commit insurance fraud? This, my friends, is not normal behavior. His father-in-law also gave an affidavit, but all he said was that Darren came over and asked if he knew of anyone who would burglarize his home. He doesn't give any further information and doesn't mention if even Darlie Key, Darlie's mom, was aware of it. This I don't have an answer to. Now, I could be wrong, but I feel that Darlie Lynn would have been as shocked as the kids if they were to come home to a burglarized house. Now, another thing that's interesting is this, that during the statements that both Darren and Darlie gave to the police shortly after the crime, both of them mentioned having a conversation the evening before the crime. Darlie is the only one who said, "We had words." And I always wanted to know what she meant by that. In Darren's affidavit, he said that on this night, Darlie had asked Darren for a separation. If all of this had come out in court, I don't believe that Darlie would be where she is today. As a matter of fact, I believe that Darlie was doing the best she could in the situation she was in. I do not believe she committed this crime. I do believe that she was in the middle of a manipulative marriage with a guy who was in complete control of her life and someone who she probably didn't realize was as morally corrupt as he was. Do I think Darren was involved? 100%. Do I believe he committed the crime? I'm not 100% sure on that as to whether he actually did the deed himself or aided someone in breaking into their home to commit the act. But I do believe he had knowledge that it was going to happen. We know that he will do illegal things for money. He's admitted it. We also know that he was in some pretty serious financial debt at the time. And now he knows his wife was going to leave him and she was worth $250,000. It would make sense. One thing that did come out in trial was how the boys' injuries were different from Darlie's. So this is one of the things that they used to convict Darlie. That somehow this signified that she must have been the perpetrator and then tried to cut her own throat. Now, I had a different opinion. I think that whoever it was who tried to harm Darlie had a difficult time doing so because they were emotionally attached to her. The marks on her were as if someone were hesitant to kill her. Now, from what I've watched and listened to from Darlie's family, Darren would never do such a thing. Now, it's hard to look at someone who's close to you and see what they want you to see. Sometimes they can put on a good act. Darren did for years. He appeared on talk shows. He stayed married to Darlie even after she was incarcerated. He did all of the things he was supposed to do. From an outsider viewpoint, though, he appeared to value money more than he did anything else. Sure, he said all the right things and he did all the right things when it was required of him. But the average person does not try and commit insurance fraud because they need some extra cash. And he didn't seem too concerned about who knew because he went to his father-in-law, for crying out loud. And then he said that he told, quote unquote, several people about his plans. Where are these people now? Were they people he wanted to hire? Or were they just conversations with friends or coworkers? We don't know. Some other things that didn't sit right with me were the time when Darlie had to ask to have a car around so that she could take the kids places during the day. Now, Darren's car wasn't working, so he took her car, this Pathfinder, which he later referred to as his Pathfinder, to work, essentially leaving Darlie stranded. The night before the crime, when it was mentioned about Darlie taking Dana home the night before the crime. Now, there's two things that I have to point out here. Darlie did say that she said, "Hey, I wasn't feeling well." But there was another instance where there was testimony as to, well, why didn't Darlie just take Dana home? And then Darren had said how difficult that would have been to have to load up all the kids in the car along with him and take Dana home. Why would Darlie have to take the kids? Why would Darren have to go with her? Couldn't Darren just have stayed home with the kids for like an hour? Why did he feel the need to be involved? Next, and I apologize, this might be a little all over the place. I'm trying to keep it as organized as possible. Next, we do have both of them, both Darren and Darlie, freely talking to the police whenever the police wanted them to come in and make a statement or just talk with them. Not once did either one of them ever ask for an attorney. So this, looks good for both of them, right? I mean, maybe not smart, but it looks good. I have my own theories on this. Surprise, surprise, right? Think about this for a second. They went together to the police station, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, that Darren, for instance, did ask for an attorney while Darlie did not. What do you think would be going through Darlie's head? It was a catch-22 for both of them. If either one asked for an attorney, then the other one would think that they were to blame. I really don't understand why, though, they didn't just decide together to ask for an attorney. It could be because they really didn't have anything to hide, right? It could also be that they were just young and they didn't know any better. Next, I want you to think about this. When Darlie called 911, Damon was still alive. Damon could have identified the attacker. Why would Darlie risk that? Why would Darren? Could this be why Darren spent most of his time working on Devin, knowing he had already passed and hoped that by biding his time, he wouldn't have to wait long for Damon to do the same? Yes, I know this sounds super callous of me, right? But when you're used to studying serial killers and murderers, it doesn't pass the smell test, and it doesn't seem too far fetched. People have done worse. They've even done similar. Consider the Chris Watts case. While most people believe that he murdered his wife and daughters to be with another woman, he was also under considerable financial strain. He had a $400,000 mortgage, he had credit card debt over $70,000, student loans, car payments, and they were facing a $1,500 homeowners association lawsuit. So it's definitely not unheard of. And this is just one case. There's the Menendez brothers, who prosecutors believed the crime was committed for the family money. And then there was the Coleman family murders in 2009. And this is where Chris Coleman murdered his wife and his two young sons. He happened to work as head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries. And the company had a policy against divorce and adultery. He didn't want to lose his high-paying job if he divorced his wife because he wanted to be with another woman. So instead, he murdered his family. So it's not unheard of, not by a long shot. And that's not all. So many times people make reference to Darlie's statements and how they're contradictory. Well, we have her written statement, we have her testimony all straight out of Darlie's mouth, but we also have testimony from authority figures who talk about what Darlie told them, but they have no proof. There's no recordings, there's no written documentation, there's no audio, there's nothing. All we can do is take their word for it. And while we're on the topic of contradictory statements, let's take a look at what Darren had to say. I first want to start with a small portion of Darlie's initial statement to the police. And this is what she says, quote, "She went back to Damon, who had stopped moving at that point, and the police walked through the door. Paramedics came in and tried to work on the children. Darren was screaming, 'Who did this? Who did this?' And Darlie began asking if her babies were dead. Darren was crying and said yes. How did he know? After that, she just remembers screaming, and she showed Darren her neck. Darren took her out to the front of the house, and by then, Darren ran upstairs to check on Drake and then handed Drake to Karen." So here's some portions from Darren's statement. Darren says that they were watching a movie on HBO. After Drake fell asleep around 10 to 10:30 p.m., he said he took Drake up to their room and into the crib. He put the blanket on him and he turned off the lights. He then went back downstairs to talk to Darlie. He said the conversation centered around the business, bills, and how Darlie was having a hard time taking care of the kids all today. Now, personally, I don't know what he meant by this. I don't know if he was referring to the conversation about the vehicle being gone and her not being able to take the kids anywhere. But anyway, he continues. Darlie said she wanted to sleep on the couch because the baby kept her awake. The boys were asleep on the floor. Devin was face up in front of the television, and Damon was between the couch and the coffee table near Darlie. I'm going to pause here. Darren is very specific about where the kids are and how they're laying. All I can do is put myself in his shoes. And I can tell you that if someone asked me how my kids were laying, if they're sitting there laying out on the floor after they'd fallen asleep, I don't know what I'd be able to tell you. Kids move around a lot when they sleep. Not all of them, but most of them. They are just very fidgety even when they sleep. Next, Darren says he went upstairs to get Darlie a blanket and a pillow, and they talked a little bit more about her going to Cancun with some friends across the street. He gave her a kiss goodnight and told her to dream about him and went upstairs around 1 o'clock in the morning. He said he turned on the television in our room and watched for 10 to 15 minutes. Now, That's the same room that Drake was in. Wouldn't that have woken up Drake? He then said that he took off his glasses and then turned off the television. And here, I don't understand why he's mentioning his glasses and not his clothing. Why not mention jeans, t-shirt, etc. that was taken off? Why just the glasses? He then says that he couldn't sleep for a while, but finally fell asleep. And unconsciously, he heard a noise and then Darlie screaming, yelling, "Devin, Devin, oh my God, Devin." He woke up quickly, grabbed his glasses on the nightstand, and ran downstairs as fast as he could. What is this obsession with his glasses? Going into the Roman room, he ran over to Devin laying on the floor where he was last seen, and kneeled down to see if he was hurt, and then looked at the coffee table to see it tipped over on him. When he looked again at his chest, there were 2 holes, and I am not going to go over the graphic details here, but just know that Darren slapped his face to try and get a response. And then let's continue with Darren's version. Darren said that he started CPR and then blew into his mouth, and when he did, air came out of the wounds. He blew 5 or 6 times and then held his hands over the wounds, and when that didn't work, he blew into one of the wounds in his chest. He then said he looked over at Darlie, and she was on the phone calling 911. He then ran over to Damon, who was on the floor in the hallway between the wall and the side of the couch. He said Damon did not have a pulse, but he couldn't see any injuries. Police came in, and my first question was, how did they get inside? And Darren told him that his babies were stabbed. Okay. How did he know Damon was stabbed? He said he couldn't see any injuries on Damon. So how did he know this? And he said Darlie told the police that the guy went out in the garage. Darren then said that he ran upstairs to put his pants on. Now, why mention this now? Why didn't he mention taking off his pants? Did he have pants on when he was downstairs talking with Darlie when they were sitting there on the couch? And you might think I'm being nitpicky, but just wait until we continue on. He looked over at Drake, and Drake was crying in his crib, but he felt that he was okay. He then noticed his wallet left on the floor. Now, what an odd thing to notice, right? And all he could do was to think to go to Karen's for help. He said that he needed someone to help the paramedics when they arrived. For God's sakes, why? The paramedics were professionals. Why did he feel the need to have someone, quote unquote, help them? He then said that he went downstairs, ran out of the house, and ran across the street to Karen and Terry's door. He banged on the door until Terry comes to the door first. And when he told them that Devin and Damon were stabbed, they were in shock and ran over with me to the house. And that was when they were putting Damon on a stretcher. He then said, I knew that Devin was dead before I ran across the street, and Damon had no pulse, but the paramedic carried him out in a blanket out the front door. I ran out yelling, and I'm not sure when this was, we have to find out who did this. And Karen told me that Darlie was cut too. Now, earlier, if you recall, in Darlie's statement, she said that she showed Darren her neck. Darren continues, I never knew that she was hurt, yet she had blood all over her from the neck down to the bottom of her nightshirt. She was standing in the doorway with the paramedics and said she needed to go to the hospital. So we helped her onto the stretcher, and she said, Darren, you have to promise me we will find this man. He killed our babies. I walked back into the house, pushed my way through the police, and saw the knife on the bar in the kitchen with blood all over it. And then it was illegible. Went to garage, illegible, to look at the window that the police had said he entered. And I went out of the house and walked across the street, and neighbors were there to comfort me and ask me about what happened. I sat for a minute on a curb and walked over to the ambulance where Damon was and asked the paramedic if he was alive, and they said no. I was in shock. Okay, so end of statement. Let's talk about the glasses and the pants. This is something that has always struck me as being strange, is Darren mentioning his glasses. He makes reference to this when he said he went to bed and he took off his glasses, but he doesn't mention taking off any other clothing. But he doesn't do this once. He does this twice, mentioning the glasses that he put them on after he heard Darlie screaming and before running downstairs. Now, if you personally, think about this, if you personally are describing yourself heading to bed, what are you going to say? You might say, I went upstairs, I brushed my teeth, I changed into my pajamas, and then I sat and watched television for a while. Personally, I wear glasses. I don't even think about taking my glasses on or off. It's just something I do. And I'm often not even aware that I've done it because it is such a habit. When Darren doesn't mention taking off clothing for bed, it's leaving this gap in the story. Maybe he didn't undress and he wasn't truly heading to bed, but he had other plans. Maybe he's focusing on his glasses because he wants to give this impression that his routine was normal. And by taking away those other mundane details like brushing your teeth or taking off your clothes, it gives him less things to remember if he's questioned later on. When Darren runs back upstairs, quote unquote, to put his pants on, he notices his wallet on the floor. Now, this is another odd comment. Of all things that are happening, all of this chaos and this horrible situation that your family is now in, why are you focusing on the wallet on the floor? It doesn't vibe with the current chaotic situation. If Darren were involved and had staged the scene, mentioning this wallet on the floor could be a way to create a false narrative. But let's also not forget about the pants. He never mentions taking off his clothing before going to bed, but then says he had to run back upstairs and put his pants on. Okay. Darlie's statement says that after screaming for Darren, he ran downstairs with his jeans on and no glasses. So again, with the glasses, to focus on such an odd item, this seems way too convenient. And the fact that both of them mention this in their statements is just strange. It's almost as if they had a conversation prior to making the statements to the police. Yet in the hearing to hold Darlie without bond, Darren testified here, and he said that the first thing that woke him up was, quote, glass breaking and Darlie screaming. Okay, and we'll also get to this. In this same testimony, he said he had been asleep maybe an hour to an hour and 15 minutes before he heard the glass and Darlie. He's asked if he wears glasses, and he says yes, and then says that the first thing he did after he heard the glass/Darlie was grab his glasses. He said he sleeps in the nude, but that before going downstairs, he put his pants on. Now, this thing about the glasses is just weird. It's an odd thing to focus on in the middle of this scene. It does make it appear as though this was a planned effort to talk about the glasses in their statements. But if it was meant to create this story that was the same between both of them, it obviously failed miserably. So this implies that one of them was not being truthful. Darren also mentions that originally, when he said he ran upstairs to put his pants on, that all he could think of was going to Karen's for help because he needed someone to help the paramedics. And again, why in the world would he think that the paramedics needed help in the first place? If Darren was genuinely focused on saving his children, it would make far more sense for him to stay rather than running outside and across the street. Plus, he has reminded us on a couple of occasions he knows how to do CPR, right? It creates the appearance that he was trying to do something helpful, but doesn't make any sense to do what he's doing. In his statement, he said, quote, I knew that Devin was dead before I ran across the street. And Damon had no pulse, but the paramedic carried him out in a blanket out the front door, unquote. Darren's knowledge that Devin was dead and Damon had no pulse could justify why he ran across the street to Karen's. He might be trying to make it seem as though he had done all he could inside the house and felt that there was nothing left to do for his children. So he ran across the street. Now, in the meantime, his wife is still there and hurt, obviously bleeding, yet he leaves the house. Darren also said that Damon had no pulse, but points out that the paramedics still brought him out of the house. So a couple of things. If Darren was so sure that Devin was dead and Damon had no pulse, there was no need for him to run over and get Karen in the first place to get quote unquote help for the paramedics. If he thought that both of his children were beyond help, running for help seems contradictory. So this could suggest that this decision to leave the house was for another reason other than getting help for his kids. Darren's statement, where he says, I ran out yelling that we have to find out who did this, and Karen told me that Darlie was cut too. I never knew that she was hurt, yet she had blood all over her from the neck down to the bottom of her nightshirt. She was standing in the doorway with the paramedics and said she had to go to the hospital. So we helped her onto the stretcher, and she said, "Darren, you have to promise me we will find this man. He killed our babies," unquote. So let's totally forget the timeline for a second, because this in and of itself does not make a lot of sense in regards to running out and yelling. So let's focus on the fact that Karen told him Darlie had been cut too. And it was Karen evidently that had to point this out. This is incredibly difficult to believe that Darren did not know that Darlie was injured. Her shirt was covered in blood, covered. In her statement, she said that she showed Darren her neck. It's clear, though, that Darren seems to be mainly focused on the children, and he gives little, if any, attention to Darlie's injuries. Why wasn't he more concerned about her? And something else that doesn't make sense. He describes in detail the condition of Devon's wounds and Damon not having a pulse, but is completely unaware of Darlie's injuries. This is inconsistent at best. If Darren was involved in the crime and knew more than he was saying, this statement about being unaware of Darlie's injuries could be a way to pretend that he didn't know about it. And instead, he's trying to make it look like he's just way too focused on the kids and didn't even pay attention to his wife, making himself appear, as an overwhelmed and shocked father. But again, it just doesn't make any sense that he would overlook this just simply because of the amount of blood that was on her shirt. Darren states in his official statement that Darlie said to him while getting into the ambulance, "Promise me we will find this man." Now, this appears in Darren's statement, but not Darlie's. So by writing this in his statement, Darren might be trying to set the stage, right? That an intruder was possible. In Darren's statement, he also says that he walked back into the house, pushed his way through the police, and saw the knife on the bar in the kitchen with blood all over it. He then went to the garage to look at the window that the police said he had entered. And I went out of the house and walked across the street, and there's a bit more, but I don't want to focus on that right now. The statement about pushing through the police kind of makes you go, what? By this time, Damon has been taken out to an ambulance, as has Darlie. Devon is still in the house. At this point, it's a crime scene. What are the actual odds that the police that are there are going to let him rush in and disrupt this crime scene? It is highly unlikely, but it sets the stage that if his DNA or fingerprints happen to be found in the area, and honestly, why wouldn't they? He lived there. But let me continue. He might be attempting to make himself seem more involved in investigating the crime, or using this account of pushing through the police to throw off any evidence that may point to him that might be there during the crime. It definitely would mess up the crime scene if in fact he did this, which I don't believe he did. The comment about the knife is strange. Again, this is if, in fact, he actually did go through the house, as he said he did. Because remember, Devon is still there. He's in the living room. He's on the floor. And Darren fixates on the knife. And the garage window, not just the garage, but the window screen. It's unusual in a chaotic and terrible scene like this to want to investigate what happened. And how did he know that the screen was a point of entry? I might be missing something here. I don't know. But in both Waddell's and Walling's testimony, the first two officers on the scene, there is no mention that Darren is there other than talking about whether or not he had blood on his hands. And remember, Waddell didn't go to the garage until Walling got there. And even then, Walling took the lead and saw the screen. I don't know if either one of them said something to Darren. I would be absolutely surprised if they did, but I don't know. And then, instead of wanting to rush off to be with his child or his wife at the hospital, he claims that he rushed back into the home past these officers to see what had happened. After he supposedly did this, he then makes his way across the street to sit on a curb. Now, by this time, Darlie has been in the ambulance. Darren was not allowed to go with her. He evidently tried to get into the ambulance with her. They wouldn't let him. He then said that he sat on the curb. He walked over after sitting on this curb for a while. He then walked over to the ambulance to ask a paramedic if Damon was still alive. And evidently this paramedic told him no. It's my understanding that Damon was taken out of the house first because he was the most dire, right? Paramedics did say they took Damon into an ambulance and they were performing life saving measures on Damon for about 15 minutes at the scene. Now, for Darren to say that he did all this, he stormed through all these police and went through the house to quote unquote investigate and then went out and sat on a curb and then happened to see an ambulance with Damon in it and asked the paramedics about his condition. This does not make any sense. Why is he only now concerned with Damon's condition? And would a paramedic give this information to a parent while they're focused on saving a child? I don't believe so. But now let's incorporate Waddell's testimony into this mix. So Waddell said he was the first officer on the scene. He says that when he showed up at the house, Darren was outside. He was wearing blue jeans, no shirt and no shoes. And that Darren was outside the house and yelling for help. Now, I want to point out a couple of things here. In the hearing to hold Darlie without bond, Darren was questioned as to how this first officer got into the house. And he said that Darlie must have let him in, that he was not outside when Officer Waddell first arrived, that he was inside the house tending to one of the children. But then we hear additional testimony from a neighbor, William Gorsuch, who testified that he was woken up because he heard yelling. And when he looked out his own window, they live across the street from the Routiers, Darren was running from the front of the home down the sidewalk yelling that, quote, someone has stabbed my children or my kids and my wife. He said he was almost broadcasting it to the neighborhood. Now, a side note here, if in fact Darren was yelling, someone stabbed my kids and my wife, then he already knew that Darlie had been injured. Yet he claims that he wasn't aware of it until Karen told him. So let's go back to Mr. Gorsuch. He recalls that Darren was only in jeans, no shirt, no shoes, just jeans. Then he saw an officer pull up, and this would have been Waddell. He saw Darren meet with Waddell and then enter the house with him. Mr. Gorsuch approximates this to be around 2:40 in the morning. Now, I think that he's a little off, or his clock was a little off, because Darlie made the 911 call around 2:30 in the morning, and it took Waddell about 3 to 4 minutes, I believe, to get there. So it was likely more around 2:35 or so. But even then, Darren would have been alerted by Darlie, come downstairs, ran to Devin, performed CPR on Devin, checked on Damon, and then evidently ran upstairs to put his jeans on. Could all of this have happened in the span of 3 to 4 minutes? If in fact it did, he didn't attend to Devin for very long, which interestingly contradicts what he said in the bond hearing, where he said that he was with Devin around 3 to 4 minutes. I think the most likely scenario with this is that Darren actually did have his pants on the entire time, as Darlie had said in her statement, that he came downstairs with his jeans on and no glasses. So for some reason, Darren doesn't want to be remembered for being outside of the house when the first officer arrived. When Waddell walks into the house, the first child that he comes across and sees is Damon. And he noted that Damon was alive, he was moving, he was gasping for breath when he arrived. He said Damon had blood all over his back and that his eyes were open. This contradicts what Darren had said in his statement, that when he saw Damon, he didn't see any injuries. He mentions getting close enough to him to attempt to get a pulse, but still claims he didn't see any injuries. Yet when Waddell comes inside, he says Damon had blood all over his back and his eyes were open. This is important. Despite Damon still moving and gasping for breath, Darren was still focused on Devin, who had likely already passed. He even told Darlie as much, but he still continued to work on him after Waddell arrived, even though Damon was still alive. Darren then told Waddell that Devin was already gone. He said, it's no use. And Waddell said that he noticed Darren getting up and walking towards Damon at some point, but didn't pay attention to what Darren was doing because he was watching the garage area, because this is where Darlie said the person had gone. During all of this, Waddell said that he told Darren and Darlie to go sit by the patio doors because the paramedics were arriving. He didn't want them getting in the way of their work. And Waddell also believes that at some point after sitting there, Darren got up and went outside again. I'm not sure exactly when this was in the timeline. But as I mentioned, the paramedics, they continued to work on Damon at the scene for a full 15 minutes and then while on the way to the hospital, but his condition had not improved. Now, it's likely at the hospital that they called his time of death. However, according to Darren, they had already told him that he was dead while still at the scene. This is another inconsistency in Darren's statement because it was obvious that they continued life saving measures all the way to the hospital. The paramedics felt that there might be hope for Damon just simply due to them focusing on their efforts. But according to Waddell, Darren seemed to prioritize the life saving efforts on Devin, who had already passed. In paramedic Brian Koshak's testimony, he also says that he attended to Darren while at the scene and he didn't find any injuries. However, Darren never mentions this in his statement or at any other time of his testimony. So I know that this is getting kind of long. So I'm going to run through just a few things that I noted in trying to get this all gathered, right? First, let's talk about the attack, the night of the crime. We all know that Darlie, Devin, and Damon, they were all sleeping downstairs while Darren and the baby Drake were upstairs in the parents' bedroom. Now, this bedroom, interestingly, sits directly above the room, I believe, where the attacks took place. In Darren's testimony for the hearing to hold Darlie without bond, he testifies that the first thing that woke him up was, quote, glass breaking and Darlie screaming. He doesn't say this in his initial statement, however. So the question is, if he could hear glass break, which we all know was from a wine glass, from all the way upstairs, but he couldn't hear a struggle that was happening just below him, it leads to questions. Now, the fact that he was upstairs and Darlie and the boys, the older boys, were downstairs, it provides Darren with an alibi, kind of. It's not like Drake could testify as to where his dad was, right? And yes, this also leads into the question of why, with Darlie being the only adult in this area at the time of the attack, would you not be aware of it until after the attack had occurred? In this case, you can't blame Darren for not hearing something if Darlie was right there as well, right? One idea that I never heard approached, but I had actually written in my notes very early on, was whether or not Darren and Darlie collaborated on this, which then leads to further questions, right? What exactly did they collaborate on? Did they collaborate on a murder? Did they collaborate on having the house robbed in the middle of the night? Or was this what Darlie was told? Maybe that she agreed with this. They collaborated on it. This is what she was told, but Darren had other plans. There are so many unanswered questions still to this day that I don't know we will ever get the answers to. Now, this is not a new idea either. This has kind of been brought up on a couple of occasions because I've often wondered why was Darlie so certain that Darren was not involved? So let's go through just a few things. So let's consider Darren being the person who committed this crime. He was under significant financial strain. He had tried to get a loan, which was not a $5,000 loan, which was not approved. He was planning an insurance scam, all of this these financial issues, along with the different insurance policies that were on not only the children, but on Darlie, could potentially suggest a motive, especially if Darren felt that their current situation was dire. He had the opportunity. He was present in the house at the time of the murders. Although he claimed to be asleep upstairs with Drake, there are inconsistencies in his story, like whether or not he was inside the house or outside the house when the first officer arrived. There are gaps in his story about when he performed CPR on Devin and what he did after the crime. His behavior, especially immediately after the murders, including running outside to get the neighbors instead of focusing on his children, this has been noted. This is suspicious. He focused on his glasses and the fact that he never noticed anything wrong with Darlie. So let's talk about Darlie. Darlie has consistently maintained that an intruder was responsible. She even gave this vague description of this perpetrator. But her story does have some inconsistencies, and It's not hard to wonder if she might be covering for Darren. If she had some knowledge of his involvement, but it's something that she just couldn't personally face, it's possible that she just went along with this narrative about an outside attacker. But I do want to put a little note there where there is still that fingerprint, right? Inside the house that is still being tested, that evidently was left by an adult and does not belong to anybody in the Routier family. She was Darlie was incredibly depressed. And it's kind of not hard, to see why. I mean, she's home. She's home with 3 kids. She just had a baby. Postpartum depression, I don't care who you are, it is a real horrible, terrible thing. But I don't think that she was given the care that she needed to have at that point in time, and especially from her husband. Her husband still continued to go to work all these hours. She was left alone with the kids. When his car broke down, he took her car, so she had nowhere to go. We don't know. He constantly talks about money. We don't know if Darlie was completely 100% financially relied on his income. Did she receive anything of her own that she could use as she wished? Did she have the freedom to do whatever that she wanted to do without either the approval or the involvement of Darren? If she was aware of Darren's potential role, she might have been in denial. It's, very possible that she simply couldn't believe that he would be capable of doing such a thing. And this is not unusual. People in close relationships usually have a hard time accepting that someone, especially a loved one, could commit such a horrendous attack, especially when they're given all of the evidence. Say, hey, here, look at this. This is inconsistent. So is this. But they could never do such a thing. So let's talk about the intruder. There wasn't really evidence of forced entry. The screen on the window was cut, yes, but there were no signs that someone had actually used this as a way to get in or out. In trial, the blood evidence and Darlie's injuries suggest that the crime scene was staged, but as we'll later find out, the person who testified about these kind of ended up having his own issues a little bit later on, and a few of his other cases were reversed. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Now let's talk about the statements, and this is just going to be real brief because the focus on the glasses and the jeans, this really has me, I know, it's just kind of won't, it's just kind of gnawing at me. Both Darlie and Darren make it a point of mentioning something about Darren's glasses. Now, this is unusual. Like I said, I wear glasses. My husband wears glasses. I saw him this morning. I couldn't tell you if he had his glasses on or not. I really couldn't. This is not something that I pay attention to. So this seems really strange. It seems deliberate. And that is concerning. It would mean that they both said, hey, this is what we're going to talk about. We're both going to mention my glasses. The focus on glasses, it seems strange, right? I've said this how many times? You're probably tired of hearing it. So how could this have come about? Well, a couple of things. Maybe Darren prepped Darlie to mention his glasses as a way to, hey, emphasize that he was asleep upstairs and he had to get ready before he ran downstairs. Or they were both aware that their stories need to be synchronized and thought that the detail about the glasses would give the story credibility. But there's 2 different versions of the story. So if this were the case and the stories were meant to align, they obviously do not. And the jeans. Darren says he had to run upstairs to put on his pants before he came back down, and this was when the police arrived. Darlie says that when he first came downstairs, he already had them on. And Darren also says the same exact thing, but not in trial, I don't believe, but in the bond hearing or the hearing to hold Darlie without bond. He testified that he put his pants on because he slept in the nude and he came downstairs after Darlie yelled. Another thing about these pants is that it is said that Darren's bloody jeans were actually found in the utility room of the house. But then in testimony, when Darren arrives at the hospital, he is said to be wearing jeans and a t-shirt that was provided by Terry Neal, and the police took these clothes into custody at the hospital. So my question is, were these the same jeans or did Darren change into a different pair? Now, I couldn't find the information about these jeans in the utility room within the documentation that I have, but There is one photo, and I'm gonna if you're watching on YouTube, I'll throw this up on YouTube, which is defense exhibit number 79, and I'm sure you could Google this as well, and it'll show up. It shows the picture of inside the Routier household of the kitchen. It shows a picture of an open drawer with towels inside. However, on top of this drawer appears to be a pair of men's jeans with blood on them. Why are those jeans there? I don't remember this ever being a part of the testimony or anybody bringing this up. Could it be because they're Darren's and Mulder promised not to bring him into the case, and so it was just completely ignored? I honestly don't know, but the fact is that the picture is there and I don't recall anybody ever talking about it or discussing it. There is so much more that can be talked about regarding this case. The discrepancies in the testimony, the information that wasn't given to the jury that probably should have been. But the bottom line is that I don't believe for a second that Darlie got a fair trial, not by a long shot. By Mulder agreeing not to mention Darren as another possible suspect, his only option was to focus on an intruder. And as far as we know, there actually may be another intruder. The thing is, though, is that I don't think that this was a random crime. Someone knew. So let's go ahead with this intruder. Someone knew that at that evening that an intruder was going to be coming into the house. It was set up for that to be allowed with the cut screen and so forth. And it is my personal opinion that it was Darren who arranged this. Whether Darlie was aware of it, I don't know. But here's what I do know is that the information provided in her trial, in my opinion, was not enough to convict her or put her where she is now. I think that so much in this trial was lacking and screwed up and didn't present the whole entire picture to the jury. And it definitely put Darlie at a disadvantage without having this information or without having this testimony available to use. I still have questions about whether or not Darren and Darlie knew that something was going to happen that evening. And the reason I think that is because just the weird comments about the glasses in their statements. It was just weird. And if they both knew that something was going to occur, what did they think was going to occur? Was it going to be just a robbery? Did Darlie think it was just going to be a robbery? Did she know anything at all? Did Darren tell her, "Hey, it's just going to be a robbery," but instead knew what else was going to occur without telling Darlie? I personally think that Darren was in shock when he found out that Darlie was actually still alive. Again, my personal opinion. And as much as I would love to go through this entire trial transcript and point out all of the discrepancies in all of the different statements, I just simply do not have time. But the fact is that they are there. If you look hard enough and you start comparing what was said in one location, what was said in another location, and don't just stick with the trial. Go to the hearing to hold Darlie without bond and grab the information from there. Go to the affidavits that were written after she was already incarcerated. All of these together create an entirely different picture of what may have happened, and it is blatantly obvious where the discrepancies in testimony come out. So let's talk about where everybody is now. Some of the main people in the case and what they're doing now, what's happened, what's going on. Now, keep in mind, this is only information that I found while searching online. I'm sure there's a lot more that isn't public, but this is what I do know right now. So let's start with Officer Waddell, the first officer on the scene. Sometime either after the trial or during the trial, because he testified at trial that he didn't work for Rowlett any longer, he actually moved to work with the Plano Police Department as an officer. It is unknown what his current status is. The second officer on the scene, James Walling, I couldn't find any public records about him. Detective Jimmy Patterson, the lead detective in this case and one of the officers who interviewed Darlie in the hospital, was later named as a defendant in a lawsuit that was filed by Darlie's mom, Darlie Key, and Darren for putting a secret microphone at the graveside of the children. And this was dismissed by the court. Chris Frosch, who was Patterson's assistant in this case, he continued to work with the Rowlett Police Department, but little is known of his career since then. Now, the prosecutor, Greg Davis, he, not surprisingly, still believes that Darlie is guilty. In 2010, he was indicted on a charge of tampering with a government record. Now, this is considered a felony in Texas. The allegations were that Davis had submitted a government document while he was employed by the Collin County District Attorney's Office. Evidently, it not only involved him, but other figures within this Collin County courthouse. In 2011, a judge dismissed the case, and the new DA decided not to keep him around, so he moved to working with McLennan County as a deputy first assistant district attorney. Toby Shook, another prosecuting attorney, he has since transitioned from the prosecution side to private practice as a criminal defense attorney, and he's currently practicing law with his own firm in Dallas, Texas. He still believes Darlie is guilty. Little is known about Sherry Wallace, who was another attorney on the prosecution side. Now, as far as Darlie's defense goes, Doug Mulder, her lead attorney, he actually continued working as an attorney up until his death at the age of 79. I believe it was in 2017 or 18. And this is after having suffered a stroke. Now, publicly, he's never questioned his methods in defending Darlie, even though this Darlie's new attorneys had filed that paperwork that pointed out that, Mulder may have had a conflict of interest. It was ultimately rejected by the courts. Richard Mosty, another one of Darlie's defense attorneys, continued to work in criminal defense. There's really not a whole lot known about his opinion on how Darlie's case was handled, and evidently hasn't commented on it, at least from what I could find. Darlie's original attorneys, Doug Parks and Wayne Huff, Parks, after he was replaced by Mulder, did express concerns about how the defense strategy for Darlie changed after he was replaced, especially the fact that now Darren was never considered a suspect. And Wayne Huff sadly passed away in 2019. So James Cron, the man who did the walkthrough in 20 to 30 minutes and determined it was an inside job, which, he may or may not have been correct about that. His work did ultimately come under, people wanted to look at it a little bit more with the new DNA testing that's now available. It challenged some of his original conclusions. He actually passed away in 2019. Charles Lynch, the trace evidence analyst, his reputation as a quote unquote expert literally came under scrutiny during several other cases. And in some of these cases, it actually led to certain issues regarding whether or not this information that he was putting forth could actually be admitted into these other cases. And this really affected his reputation. Tom Bevel, the bloodstain pattern analyst, after the trial, he continued to work in his own firm where he gives expert testimony and consulting services. He's testified in numerous cases. Some of these cases have since been overturned where his role as a bloodstain pattern analyst was used. And a couple of these were the Jason Payne case and the David Cam case. Now, Jason Payne was convicted in 2010 for the murder of his wife and her son in Texas. The case literally hinged mainly on bloodstain pattern analysis provided by Tom Bevel, who argued that the scene was staged, does that sound familiar, to look like a murder-suicide. But it was actually a double homicide. Bevel's testimony actually convinced the jury that Jason had shot both his wife and her son. Now, Payne's conviction was later overturned due to questions about the reliability of the bloodstain pattern evidence and the lack of physical evidence that directly tied him to the crime. Payne was retried and acquitted in 2016. Now, the second case, David Cam, he was a former Indiana State Trooper. He was convicted twice, once in 2002 and once in 2006, for the murders of his wife and two children in the year 2000. Tom Bevel had testified in both trials saying that the bloodstain patterns on his clothing indicated that he was in close proximity to the victims when they were shot. And it obviously became a key part of the prosecution's case. Cam's defense attorney, however, challenged Bevel's conclusions and argued that the bloodstains could have occurred during Cam's discovery of the bodies, not the actual murders. Plus, there was evidence of another suspect, Charles Boney, who was linked to the murder weapon. Cam's convictions were ultimately overturned, and in a third trial in 2013, he was acquitted of all charges. Now, the family. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the family, but here's what I can tell you. In 2011, Darren and Darlie officially divorced, although he continues to help her fight for her freedom. He, to my knowledge, remarried and is still married. The only other family member that I want to talk about is Darlie's youngest sister, Danelle, who is very active on TikTok, and she is great at giving updates about her sister and the current status of items that are still being tested for DNA. I will have her TikTok listed below in the show notes. Lastly, I want to make it very, very blatantly clear that these are my own opinions simply based on the documentation that I have read. While everyone seems to focus on Darlie's inconsistent statements, Darren's inconsistencies far outweigh anything Darlie has ever said. Whether I think Darren did it himself or he hired someone, I don't know. But he did have the most to gain. He admitted that Darlie wanted a separation, and this, along with money issues, could have been the motive. I don't know what their relationship was like, but these documents make it appear as though Darren was the one who was in control of everything, the finances, the vehicles, the purchases, and that Darlie was just supposed to sit at home and raise the kids. When Darren discovered Darlie wanted to leave him, it sent him over the edge. My theory about Darren wanting to jump in the ambulance with Darlie didn't strike me as someone who was concerned about her because he barely paid her any attention as she stood there bleeding in the home. But rather, it struck me as someone who was afraid that she was going to talk or realize more about what had happened and that he may be implicated. So many times I keep going back to their relationship dynamic. Could Darren have been a controlling husband? If so, after learning that Darlie wanted to leave him, did he have the mindset of, if I can't have you, no one will? And now she's locked up in a place where he knows he can always find her. And why was Darlie so sure that Darren had nothing to do with it? His words and his actions tell a different story. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're close to someone, it's often at times really hard to see the forest for the trees. The problem with things like this, with this trial and everything else, is that you only have access to certain pieces of information, meaning that you don't have the whole picture. I'm sure that there are things that we, as the public, don't know. Things that have been kept private for the family, things that maybe never came out in court, and we may never ever know. One thing is for sure, though, there is still testing being done on items from the crime scene, and we can only hope that with today's technology, it will be able to give us a much better idea as to exactly who was involved. Until then, we just have to wait. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on this long, sometimes frustrating, most definitely heart-wrenching case. It means so much to me, those of you who have stuck around and gone through all of this with me. Beginning October 1st, I'll be back to doing other true crime episodes. So be sure that you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you listen so that you know when these new episodes are released. Until then, thank you again so much. We will talk soon. Bye for now.